the way I wanted to sort of structure this conversation is look, I'll be honest with you. I don't subscribe to this paradigm that the clock started on the 7th of October, right?
Absolutely. No,
That
I
seven,
agree with you.
yeah, right. But in the spirit of, I guess, organizing this conversation, you and I agreed to sort of, without going too far back into history, talk about maybe for half an hour the pre 7th of October situation.
Right?
We can talk about the events of 7th of October and
Absolutely.
spend half an hour on that, and then we can talk about what happened the day after the 7th of October and what might be in store for us in future. And I'm keen to give you sort of like the space to talk about some of your peace initiatives and ideas
Absolutely.
looking forward. So a kind of past, present, and future kind of perspective. And if we jump right in and we, pre October the 7th, I want to open it up to you. How do you see Palestine and Israel, the region, the situation, the people, the day before October the 7th? What is your reading of?
I mean, it was a very bad situation. You have Hamas, which is a theocratic, anti-Semitic entity that was being ruling the Gaza Strip for 17 years. They are very tough on Palestinian dissenters. They have a theocratic ideology. Their long-term perspective is that any sort of Zionism, any sort of Jewish state has to be dismantled. I think that's what they were working towards. On the other hand, in Israel, you have a very very tough um, Israeli government that is not, as Netanyahu himself said, he's been the person blocking a two-state solution for
Mm,
however many years, decades at this
yeah,
point. I mean, he would say that the reason I'm blocking a two-state solution is because I don't trust the Palestinians, because the Palestinians want to destroy us. And on the other side, the Hamasniks would say the reason we're blocking a two-state solution is because we don't trust the Zionists. The Zionists want to destroy us. So there is this sort of mirror of really severe distrust that emanates back in time to the war in 1967 and the ongoing military occupation, of the West Bank, and up until 2005 in Gaza, and the siege and blockade on Gaza since Hamas took power. And then, of course, even before 1948, there were very serious difficulties and differences of perspectives in both the Yishuv, which was the Jewish community, and the Arab Palestinian community. And ultimately, I think what it comes down to is that there are two separate national movements. There's Zionism, which is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, and then there's Palestinian Arab nationalism, which is the national liberation movement of the people who've been left behind by Zionism.
mm.
So those two movements have been at loggerheads now for coming up for 100 years, and I think the effects of this ideological disagreement between these two groups, should there be a Zionist state, or should Palestine be part of this pan-Arab, pan-Islamic? I think that's how Hamas would see it, as a sort of they see themselves as a contributor to this pan-Islamic world. This disagreement on who should be there and who should have control of the land has echoed through time, echoed through history, and it's been a disaster for all of the ordinary normal people on the ground who just want to live
Mm.
their daily lives.
I agree. It has been a disaster, and I can probably share the majority of what you say. I mean, the way I see it, allow me a little bit to paint the
Go
picture
on.
of how I saw the situation prior to the 7th of October, because context is important, right? The backdrop is important. Okay, things don't
Absolutely.
happen in a vacuum, right? And
Absolutely.
and the way I look at the situation in the region is, I look at it within the paradigm of a dynamic of an occupying power and an occupied people, and the power imbalance that that brings, right? And so I see a situation where, I mean, look, Gaza, we all know, is one of the most densely populated parts of the world, right? And
Absolutely.
70% of the population are refugees, so they're not even from Gaza, right? And we look at the region, and we look at the strip, and we think, right, okay, it's got one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, what, 40, 45, some say 50% unemployment, higher in the youth. You've got 80% of the people relying on aid, And aid has dropped, I think, in the last 2 decades from something like a couple of billion in 2008 to a few hundred million in 2022. So you could see how the aid has dropped when 80% of people rely on aid. You have a overwhelming level of food insecurity. 95% of the water in Gaza, is poisonous, John, as you know. And
Yeah,
30 to 35% of people believe that they are food insecure. You have the UN describe, I was reading this a couple of weeks ago, and it was shocking. The UN described Gaza, right, as being turned from an area which had a low income society with modest export ties. And you're interested in economics, so you'll appreciate this. And it's gone from a low income society to with moderate um, export ties to what they describe as an impoverished ghetto with a decimated economy and a collapsing social service system. You know,
that's true.
it's absolutely crazy when you quantify the level of impoverishment that exists in Gaza, right? And a lot of that comes down to the siege, right? Where Israel controls, as you know, the land, sea, and airspace. It controls the airwaves. It introduced food rationing based on calorific intake of individual
Yeah.
Gazans. It issues bare minimum work permits to people of Gaza. If you think, I think I was reading the other day, the West Bank, in the West Bank, Israel issues about 100 odd thousand work permits for West Bank Palestinians to work in Israel proper.
It's been cancelled, hasn't it?
Has it? Well, yeah,
Since
since.
October the 7th, a lot of it's
Correct,
been cancelled.
correct, all of it. And so, what are there? About 3.5 million people in the West Bank, 100,000 work permits pre-October the 7th. In Gaza, there's what, 2.2, 2.3 million people. They issue about 15,000 work permits. So you can imagine how minimal the prospects, the employment prospects, the hopes are, for the
Awful.
people, for
It's
people in Gaza.
absolutely awful.
Yeah, it's horrible. And then not to mention
Hopeless.
that's a great way of putting it. It's hopeless. And then you look at the cycle of violence, right? And the doctrine of mowing the lawn in Gaza, which is a horrific doctrine. That's Daniel Levy. He's the guy who I think the Israeli guy who was involved in negotiations in Oslo. He describes it as a regime of structural violence. A regime of structural violence. I mean, if you're 18 in Gaza, right? If you're 18 years of age, you've seen about 12 wars,
Yeah.
12 events
Yeah.
where you've seen 500, 1,000, 2,000 ton bombs dropped on homes in and around your 25-mile strip of land. And that's an 18-year-old, right? And
I have friends from Gaza in their
yeah,
20s and 30s, right? People who are also involved in the peace movement now. They come from Gaza. These will be people, as I say, these are people in their 20s and 30s. So they've seen even more wars than that.
yeah, it's crazy. And that's not even to mention the West Bank, right? Pre-October the 7th, which saw the most, I think it was the dead pre-October the 7th, the deadliest year in violence in the West Bank, right? Where you've got armed settler terrorists, what
Yeah.
need and must be described as terrorists.
It's absolutely the case. It's terrorism. You know,
Absolutely.
my family's olive groves have been attacked.
And this systematic intimidation, harassment, and policy of what's called displace and replace. So you displace local people, you get them off their farmlands, you get them out of their homes, and you replace them with settlements. And settlements aren't these organic, isn't this organic process, right? Where people resettle because they're interested in the area. It's state policy, it's state funded, and it's illegal under international law. And it's creating a West Bank, a future Palestinian state. You're an advocate for the two-state solution. It's
Absolutely.
creating a West Bank which is basically divided into this, bandustans, if you to use this up,
Not contiguous.
not
Not contiguous.
contiguous, uh, almost impossible to create a state upon, within which settlers behave with absolute impunity with the support of the IDF. And so that's just the West Bank. And so you have this situation, right, where in the West Bank and Gaza, to use your words, which is entirely apt, it's hopeless, right? And you look at the Palestinian cause pre-October the 7th, and all avenues, John, have been blocked, right? So for you as a Palestinian or as a Palestinian supporter,
Mhm.
advocate the BDS movement, you're told that that is an anti-Semitic means of um, resistance, right?
Right.
If you, when Palestine went to the United Nations and unilaterally tried to garner support to be recognized as a state, do you know what Israel called that? Diplomatic terrorism, right? So if you're in the BDS, you're anti-Semitic. If you go through due process in the United Nations to achieve statehood, it's
Mhm.
diplomatic terrorism. If you go on the Great March of Return, you may remember the Great March of Return, unarmed, peaceful march, you get gunned down and you're shot down as terrorists. If you're
Mhm.
engaged in armed resistance, a legal right for all people, you're terrorists. If you're Fatah or the PLO and you renounce violence and you disband your militias, then you're basically rewarded with mass apartheid in the West Bank and in Gaza and an increase in settlements and delegitimization by the West and Israel. There's no
So we have to
hope.
think. We have to think. You're painting a picture, and I agree with most of what you're saying. We have to think what is going to be the most effective strategy for Palestinians, considering all of these factors that you're talking about. What's
Mm,
going to be the most effective strategy for Palestinians to achieve freedom? And I would say my stance is a two-state solution, because you're right about this. It seems very out of the frying pan into the fire. Damned
mm,
if you do, damned if you don't. And to be upfront, I would say that I generally agree with the diplomatic initiatives that the PLO takes, such as using the international legal system and international institutions and appealing to international institutions. I generally think that that is far more effective than what Hamas have done. I generally condemn Hamas's stances, which would be the violent resistance. I think violent resistance is, technically speaking, it's a right. I'm not sure, given what we this isn't Algeria, right? This isn't a situation where you've got French colonists coming and establishing something that they can then go home to France with. This is two separate national movements that are both connected to this land. So I think realistically we have to accept that we both have to live together to some extent. And I think from my perspective, every casualty makes it harder to achieve peace, and that's true for Israel as well. Israel's objectives in this current war. I mean, the stance is we're going to remove Hamas from power, but every Palestinian civilian casualty is another obstacle to peace. So I would say that what we need to pursue is we need to pursue the non-violent and diplomatic strategies as much as possible. We need, but this is the really important part. We need to pursue them with better strategy in terms of how we structure our actions and more realistic goals. Because, for example, the one of the issues that I have with BDS is I don't think BDS's goals are very realistic. They tend to advocate the complete dismantlement of Zionism and a one-state solution. And I don't think that, especially after October the 7th, I don't think Israelis are ever going to swallow that very easily. I think probably much more likely it will be more acceptable to have a two-state solution structure. And of course, one part of that we might want to negotiate for is some sort of international peacekeeping force to prevent Israeli settlers from coming into Palestine and grabbing the land, right?
mm.
And on the other hand, the international peacekeeping force would prevent Hamas 2.0 from arising and starting to manufacture rockets and starting to shoot them at Israel. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. In terms of me being a Palestinian, I'm trying to advocate for what I feel would be the most effective strategies for resistance strategies for Palestinians to establish themselves as a state, right? To establish some land and say this is legally Palestine. This is recognized by the United Nations, recognized by Israel, recognized by the United States, and this is our land, and this is our home, and this is where we're going to build a country.
So So okay, how does it do you think the partners in peace, the United States, the European Union, Israel, have allowed for a flourishing of ideas from Palestine to oppose the ideas that you might consider to be armed or violent resistance? So you can agree or disagree with BDS, and we can all have our views, and we can argue the toss as to whether it's even effective or not, right? And the BDS movement,
I
you
think
know,
boycotts are. But I think boycotts are effective.
yeah, and I would agree. Others might not, and it's built
Sure.
upon the premise that it was extraordinarily effective in bringing down apartheid South
Yeah.
Africa, the apartheid structure in South Africa, right? You create economic hardship, which is unsustainable, right? I'm not entirely sure that the economic model of Israel is equivalent of that of South Africa. Israel is a bit of a superpower, technological superpower, intellectual superpower, economic power, maybe not
I
superpower.
found out. I've been looking into this. Israel has surpassed the UK on GDP per capita. It's a
Mm.
rich. We're both living in the UK. Israel is now the 14th richest country in the world by GDP per capita.
So it's
I
interesting you say that, right? I'm not privy to that information, and and I'm learning from you, right? Israel is one of the richest nations on earth. It's certain,
it's established itself as that now.
right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, right? And through diversification of its economy, etc., etc., it's certainly one of the richest countries in the region, and yet it is the number one recipient of US aid. So, John, if I went through your bank account, right, and you said to me, Niz, I've given to 20 charities this year or last year, right? And I'm like, great, John, let's have a look at who you've been donating to, right? And all through the list, they're all, charities which support impoverished people, the homeless, the hungry, the destitute. That's great. Maybe refugees and whatnot. But top of the list, the people you pay the most aid and charity to are the richest in our society. Would I not be looking at you, John, going, why are you paying so much charity to a billionaire? Is that
A
not a
lot.
legitimate question?
That's absolutely a legitimate question. A lot of what is termed as Israeli aid is the American government subsidizing American weapon companies, right? Because what it turns into is they give a amount of aid budget to Israel, but then it has to be spent on American weapons. So effectively, what happens is the American government pays the American military industrial complex, billions of dollars, and then billions of dollars, and then weapons get sent to Israel,
So
right?
can I
So
ask you a question off the back of that? And you're in this conversation, you're the economic
yeah,
scholar here, right? Are you basically, by extension, saying it's in America's best interest that conflict resumes and maintains and exists?
that's the whole, I'm definitely a scholar of this idea in economics that there is a thing called the military industrial complex that benefits from, if not actual conflict itself, the threat of conflict. Maybe both of those things, right? So there are huge financial interests in the world that are going to benefit tremendously from weapons manufacturing, such as the shareholders in the companies that I was talking about, right? So yeah, to some extent, the aid to Israel is sort of corporate welfare for the American military industrial complex, and the American military industrial complex loves that, and of course Israel is Israel does benefit from it. I would say realistically that most probably Israel doesn't need all that aid, right? I
Mm.
I I think if we had a Palestinian state that was genuinely committed to peace, I would be advocating, let's redirect some of that aid to the new Palestinian state so we can build our infrastructure, so we can build our industry. But I think trying to get between America and Israel is a very difficult thing, because ideologically America and Israel are kind of two
Well
people
aligned.
very well aligned. And
No, I don't doubt that. But let me ask you a good faith question. I genuinely want to know your perspective on this, right?
on.
So we want to pursue peace, and so you want to get into a situation where both sides are sitting around the table and talking to each other, right?
Absolutely.
And you've got one side which represents one of the most impoverished people on earth.
Right.
Yeah. Uh, 7 million of whom are registered as refugees, 6 or so million of whom live within occupied territory, under apartheid, and the rest within Israel proper. So, this is the
Hmm.
dynamic of one side. And the other side is, as we've established, an economic superpower
Hmm.
supported by the world's richest nation, the richest nation that has ever existed on Earth, the United States,
Not per capita, but in absolute terms,
in
yes.
absolute terms, another military superpower. So you've got two nuclear military superpowers on the other side of this dynamic, right? One of which is the biggest recipient of aid from the other of which almost requires perpetual conflict for that economic model to sustain itself. And where that group shoots down any attempts at resistance from the other group, where one group occupies the other group, where one group oppresses and subjugates the other group. I want to ask you a good faith question.
Hmm.
Is this good a good starting point for negotiation?
I think that there's always. I think in a situation like
Isn't it
this,
crazy?
I think in a situation like this where we've seen the effects, the practical output of what Hamas's resistance has led to, I certainly don't think that that is the correct way forward. I think the Palestinians are in a very, very difficult position in terms of negotiation. But if we carry on like this in 5 years' time, we might be in an even more difficult position. In 10 years' time, we might be in an even more difficult position. So, realistically, for me, trying to advocate the most effective strategies for the Palestinians, the way I see it is that this might be a much better position than we're in 20 years. This might be a much better position than we're in 50 years. So we have to take the chance of trying to maximize our what we can get, maximize our share now, because I think if we look back 20 or 30 years, we were in a better position. Things have got worse,
Mm.
right? I think in some ways I feel like October the 7th probably knocked us back, 5, 10, 15, 20 years in terms of pursuing peace. And the subsequent war probably knocked us back another 5, 10 years because
I
people are hurting on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, and
So for me, it's an awful position to negotiate from, right? But sometimes you're in an awful position.
yeah, and I can appreciate that. And I think it's fruitless to try and get to a situation where there's absolute equity. In a negotiation, there's always a stronger party, right? And I
Of course.
understand that, right? And I'm a pragmatist and a realist. But I guess the point I'm making to you is not that I wish for a Hamas style perpetual state of armed resistance, right?
Yep.
Um, Even though, principally speaking, I believe in the right of resistance, even armed and violent resistance to a people. It's a
It's
legal
there
right.
it's
It's a
there in
moral right.
international law.
It's there in international
If
law.
you're militarily occupied, you have a right to resistance. With the caveats, the resistance has to be proportionate, and
Agreed.
it should target military infrastructure and military personnel, and not
Absolutely.
people, not civilians in a kibbutz.
No,
But
no, I agree. And
that's
I guess
true.
the point I was trying to make is I think part of the problem, seeing as we're in this sort of pre-October the 7th sort of conversation, part of the problem is the overwhelming power imbalance
Yeah,
in the discussion, right?
absolutely, absolutely.
I don't believe Israel and the United States of America have enough to gain from peace. I'm not saying they have nothing to gain from peace. I don't believe they have enough to gain from peace. And to counter that, the Palestinians have found themselves in a situation where they've got nothing else to lose. So when you've got a side which has nothing to lose, where death is
But they
potentially,
do have stuff. They do have stuff to lose, right? Like 70% of the housing stock in Gaza has been destroyed in this war. That
but
was
the
a
point,
huge loss.
absolutely, but the point I'm making is where life is so hopeless,
Yeah,
where life is so desperate, where
I
you
agree.
live such an impoverished life, where in the last, 18 years you've seen 12 wars and all the death that comes with it. Sometimes, right, death it is a better option or is a better solution than anything else. That's how desperate they can be. Whilst on the other side, so I'm just painting the picture of how desperate one group is. Whereas on the other side, I think there's largely indifference, political indifference. I'm not talking about the average Israeli in Tel Aviv, right? There's political, structural, systemic indifference towards peace. I mean, when you get a situation when Benjamin Netanyahu comes out and says, I am proud to be the one who prevented Palestine from having a state. And this isn't just a bit part player. Netanyahu has been in the fold since 1996, right?
He was the
That's
lead
eight,
prime minister, first prime minister in
right?
1996.
He's been around for a long time. He's had influence for a very, very long time.
Very long
And
time.
look at what it's culminated in, my friend. It's culminated. We're still talking about pre-October the 7th, right? It's culminated in what can only be described as a fascist regime, right? This guy has formed a government where, and we could talk about a little bit about this later when we talk about the response to October 7th, but this guy has formed a government with individuals who self-identify as fascists, with individuals who have been prosecuted on terrorist charges, with individuals who have been deemed too extreme to join the IDF, right? This guy has surrounded himself with bloodthirsty, megalomaniac, genocidal, self-described fascists who are supported by a United States who, as you've described, have an economic interest, potentially, arguably, we purport, in conflict. It pre-October the 7th, I think, was absolutely hopeless, to use your terms.
No, I agree. It was hopeless. Um, I think the Israeli government has fascist elements to it. Like I wouldn't describe it as entirely fascist. I wouldn't even say it's entirely fruitless to try different negotiating strategies, even on the current Israeli government. I'm hoping for a different and better Israeli government to negotiate with. Of course I am. We're
Yeah,
led by someone who doesn't describe themselves as someone who blocked peace. But even with the current Israeli government, there are certain things that the Palestinian Authority could do
yeah.
to ingratiate themselves a bit more. I mean, what one of them right now would be distancing themselves from October the 7th, condemning October the 7th, condemning anti-Semitism, even by their IHRA definition. Another thing that would ingratiate themselves with, Israel in general would probably be ending or reforming the Martyrs Fund that pays money to the families of people who have been, committed terrorist acts against Israel. That's something that rankles Israelis. So there are certain reforms that the PLO or Palestinian leaders, even in the current status quo, that could try to bring Netanyahu to the table.
So just
Of,
to understand, sorry, go on, John. I don't want to interrupt you.
but of course, there are plenty of things that the Israeli government could also do by the same token that would ingratiate themselves with the Palestinian leadership and also spur peace negotiations. So I'm in favor of anyone on any side doing anything that's positive to try and encourage peace, quite simply because I feel hopeless too. I spent the last 10 years at a really, really low level advocating for peace negotiations and for a two-state solution, and even for a one-state solution. I was probably more of a one-state solution, hippy-dippy peace and love guy, right, before October the 7th. But I've kind of realized that it was probably that's not going to be acceptable. And the more I think about it, it's because of these two separate national aspirations. There's the Palestinian Arab national aspiration and the Zionist national aspiration. And to some extent, it's like mixing milk and juice, and
Yeah,
the two struggle to mix. So my former dream of a peace and love hippy dippy
it's
one
gone.
state solution is a bit on ice.
I
But
mean,
I would like anyone to do anything to move us back towards peace
I
negotiations.
mean, I've seen this trend on your Twitter feed, and I see that you advocate a lot more for Palestinian concession than you do for Israeli reform or let's say not just Israeli reform, Israeli side reform. So one of the things that I see as a problem here is the power imbalance,
Absolutely.
right? So you've got Israel, the United States, and the EU, right? Huge, huge, huge juggernauts, right? Against what? Fatah, the PLO, and the Palestinian people, right? And there needs to be, and within that dynamic, Israel behaves and acts with absolute impunity, right? It can
With
literally
relative
do as it
impunity.
pleases. And impunity breeds extremism. Just like in a petulant child, in a toddler, right? You give the toddler free rein to do whatever they want, they will do whatever they want, right? So that power dynamic, in my view, that is too that power balance is too imbalanced, right? And that's what's causing some of the problems. But what I see you calling for a lot is, I don't want to do your views an injustice, but more concessions, more subjugation, more appeasing of the Israeli movement. So Palestine. Okay, so we've got a problem where there's no peace. What needs to happen is, Palestinians, you need to be more sorry for what's happened. You need to be vocal about being opposed to anti-Semitism. You need to restructure some of your financing, which you referred to about people who the Martyrs Fund, whatever it's called. So there's a lot of demands placed on the impoverished side, and I know you say you want to see both sides making concessions, but I don't see a huge amount of demand. And my question to you is this:
Go on.
do you, in this kind of dynamic, and I don't like using this analogy, but allow me to use it, where you've got a heavyweight boxer pinning down a 7-year-old child, right? And the 7-year-old child is flailing, and the heavyweight boxers is pinning, or the heavyweight wrestlers is pinning this child down. Do you not believe in that dynamic, that the heavyweight has a degree of control and responsibility as
A
the
lot of
occupying
people,
power?
in the UK and in the US do see it as this is a power dynamic
Hmm.
conflict, right? That Israel is by far the much more powerful, participant in the conflict, and therefore has more responsibility than the Palestinians in terms of seeking like a just and fair peace, right? And you know what? I agree. I agree. I concede that point. I think Israel does have more responsibility, and on the ground, the way it manifests is that the Israeli peace movement is, in terms of numbers, much bigger than the Palestinian peace movement. The Palestinian peace movement on Twitter is probably about 30 people, 20
Yeah.
people, 30 people. And there are thousands of Israeli peace activists. And how effective they are is, up for debate. They certainly haven't managed to get rid of Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich yet. But I agree, Israel has far more responsibility than the Palestinians, because the Palestinians are flailing about. Okay, I probably don't agree with your heavyweight boxer versus a 7-year-old child analogy. I think that maybe that's a bit oversimplifying. But yeah, Israel has far more responsibility. But when you apply that to me, you have to remember I'm Palestinian. I come from a Palestinian background, and I'm trying to advocate for Palestinians the most effective strategies,
Mm, mm,
as
mm.
as opposed to just turning my cannon on Israel, where I have very, very little. I don't vote in Israeli elections, right? I mean, I don't vote in Palestinian elections, but there aren't very many Palestinian elections at the moment. But from my point of view, I'm trying to advocate for Palestinians to adopt a better strategy, and that's why you see me talk so much about what Palestinians should do. But there's probably 10 or 50 times as much stuff that Israelis can do, right? Like, you know, go out in the streets, protest against Netanyahu, right? That's one thing I would advocate for, right? Advocate for peace negotiations with the PLO. That's what I would say to Israelis. Advocate for peace negotiations with the PLO.
And
Even
stop delegitimizing the PLO and undermining the PLO by attacking, fragmenting, and destabilizing the patch of land that they have influence over, the
Yeah,
West Bank.
absolutely. Get the settlement movement under control. Stop the hilltop youth. Stop the people burning Palestinian olive groves. That, that's what I would say. And as I do have some Israeli followers, that's something that I can do. I can advocate
Mm,
directly to them
mm,
what what Palestinians are hoping for. But I would say the most important thing, and you might be surprised to hear me say this. So some of my critics will be surprised to hear me say this, I think. The most important thing they can do is avoid civilian casualties in Gaza. That's the most important thing. And avoid and get aid to the Palestinian people in Gaza on the ground. That these things can start to rebuild trust. Get aid to Palestinian civilians on the ground. Use airdrops. Use the
yeah.
truck. You let more trucks in. Let more
Mm.
trucks in. And put measures in place so that the aid actually gets to the civilians and isn't stolen by Hamas.
And to be fair to you, you've spent a lot of time advocating for that online, particularly the airdrops, and and it's a noble cause. And I guess we can talk about the situation post October the 7th, but it might be a good time to sort of switch over and talk
Yeah,
about the events of October the 7th
yeah,
themselves. This is a difficult topic because no doubt a lot of your followers are gonna misrepresent my views here. They're gonna call me all sorts, and they're gonna hurl a lot of abuse. And I guess what I'm interested in is, from a sociological perspective, it's important to ask the question: to what extent will human beings, react when they're pushed into or exposed to, what can you call it, extreme circumstances or conditions, right? So when you're extremely scared or extremely impoverished or extremely threatened or faced with extreme hopelessness, as we've talked about, right? To what extent will a human being respond? To what extent will that response be in and of itself extreme, right? So forget the Arab-Israeli conflict, forget you're Palestinian, forget I'm Arab, forget this conflict. Just
yeah,
talking about human behavior, right? Irrespective of the current situation, just from a human sociological perspective, right? I think it's entirely predictable that human beings pushed to extreme limits will react in ways that would be considered extreme, right?
absolutely.
And I think to deny the Palestinians this universal human characteristic, right, is to dehumanize the Palestinian people. It's to
Agreed.
treat them like cattle, John, right? It's to treat them like farmyard cattle. It's to suggest that we can round them up, we can subjugate them, we can limit their hopes, we can limit their freedoms, we can limit their rights, and we can attack them every couple of years, and they will just accept it like cattle, like sheep on your farm, right? This is part of the systematic and structural undertones of the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And this is the question I'm interested in. I'm not an economist, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a historian, but I'm interested in human behaviors, right? And we've talked about the situation on October the 7th, right? And I'm interested in, what are the dynamics that can create such an extreme response? And so if we move on to the events of October the 7th, I know there's the infamous video, right? That the IDF have
Yeah,
given to
I've seen
journalists.
the bearing
That's
witness.
right. Yeah, you've been invited to see that. Do you want to sort of start by telling us a little bit about the video?
I actually sat 2 seats away from Owen Jones, so
Yeah,
he was also at the
yeah,
same screening, right?
yeah. I mean,
Um,
tell me what, as much as you want. I know it must have been a difficult watch,
I mean,
but
some people have described it as as atrocity propaganda for the IDF, right? But for for me, I went into it thinking this is going to be pretty horrendous because I'd already seen certain things in relation to October the 7th. I'd heard about what happened. I'd heard about the death toll. It's a it's a video of Hamas operatives engaging in terrorism, and it's terrorism that is explicitly aimed at civilians. They see a civilian in a car, they shoot him. They shot a dog. They shot a boy's father. I think Owen Jones talked about this in his video. They shot the father of two boys and then went to the fridge and stole their Coca-Cola. Right. So
mm,
it is for whatever people may think of the IDF or Israel. It's a harrowing video, and I think you're absolutely right. the people in Palestine, in Gaza, are extremely traumatized. People do not behave like this unless they're mentally disturbed. So all of these years of conflict, all of these people who have lost their parents to the conflict, or their brothers or their sisters, these people murdering the people in Israel, and you know, certainly the Bearing Witness film strongly suggested also sexual and rape elements, such as there's a burnt corpse, a female corpse that's had her underwear removed, for example. And these, you know, I'm sorry if I upset anyone with that description. It's a horrendous thing. And you know, and there are pictures of toddlers with you know, blood coming out of their throat. That's something I remember. But anyone who commits these atrocities is severely mentally disturbed, and you know, most probably subject to pretty extreme, you know, ideological indoctrination. But both of those things have to be looked at. Both the extreme trauma of Palestinians in Gaza that can lead to this ideological indoctrination, and the ideological indoctrination itself. And of course, what has this created? It's created another trauma cycle where the people in Israel are extremely traumatized from, you know, I've spoken to people in Israel who have lost over 15 family members, right? And by the same token, I've spoken to, you know, one of the people I talked to from Gaza, he's lost over 25 of his family members. So there's this extreme spiral of trauma on both sides, and people need mental health help. They don't need bombing, right? We need to send in doctors to help these people who are just so severely traumatized. I think and that has to be part of the de-radicalization process, in my opinion. Is we have to look at what is the collective trauma on both sides, what mental health, psychological health, physical health needs do these people have, and we need to address that. And that has to be part of the truth and reconciliation process, I think, that we need to have on the road to a two-state solution.
Part of the thing that I found difficult with this conversation about October the 7th is that the conversation has been void of nuance, right? There's no allowance for nuance. There's this sort of zero-sum game where you either condemn 7th of October in its entirety, or you're a terrorist support. Yeah, and that's your right to, right?
Yeah.
Or the alternative is you're a terrorist supporter. So there's no place for those who wish to seek the truth, right? And wish to understand fully what happened, right? And there's no allowance for this idea that a lot happened on October the 7th across a long period of time, right? So can we, because you've had the benefit of looking at the videos, and look, I wasn't there, obviously, and I'm not an expert, and I'm not privy to, you know, classified information or any of that jazz, but piecing together the events of what happened from multiple sources, right, on all the videos that you're able to see, it appears as though October the 7th happened at around about 6 a.m., right?
It started early, didn't it? Yeah.
It started early, right? And by all accounts, it lasted between 6 to 9 hours, depending on where you're talking about along the border and who you listen to. About 6 to 9 hours, right?
With a long tail of a couple of days for where there were still Hamas operatives in
embedded and hidden. Yeah, correct. Yeah. No, absolutely, right. And my understanding is after the initial entry at dawn or whatever by Hamas, there were about 3 entry points, so 3 points across the border where they broke through the fence, right? Multiple in the hours that preceded that followed that, multiple armed groups, individuals, civilians, some criminal groups, some individuals who just wanted to loot, some individuals who just wanted to have a look, some individuals who had never left Gaza and were just curious to see what Israel looked like. They came through as well, right? And created what was a very complicated, convoluted, mixed kind of situation on the ground, right? Some people were out for revenge, right? Some people, so like any society, I don't elevate Palestinian society or Arab society above any. I'm not a supremacist, right? I don't think Arab society is devoid of people with criminal intentions, right? I don't believe Arab society is devoid of people who want to commit sexual violence, right? Or want to steal, or want to burn, or want to seek revenge, right? But it looked as though there was after the initial entry by Hamas, there was a mass influx of people from Gaza, right? I believe, piecing together what I've seen, I believe clearly crimes were committed, right? So I condemn that. I don't require a need to appease Israel to condemn that. I don't need
No, of
UK
course not.
law. No, right? I don't need UK law to require me to condemn that, right? I don't need the threat of being perceived as a terrorist supporter to require me to condemn it. I don't need the Geneva Convention. I don't need the UN Charter.
Of course.
My faith, my moral compass, my religion requires me, John, to condemn and oppose and speak out against the killing of civilians and the taking of hostages of civilians. It's not permitted. It doesn't
Absolutely,
matter who it
absolutely,
is.
it
It's not
isn't.
permitted. It's not
Absolutely.
permitted. It's not permitted. And I don't accept it. And the overwhelming evidence is such that civilians were killed and that there's a good possibility that sexual violence was committed, right? Where I am unsure and where I ask questions are in the fine details and the nuance. Do I believe sexual violence was committed? I believe there's sufficient evidence to suggest there was, right?
Right.
And I condemn it wholeheartedly.
Of course.
Do I have, and is there evidence that there was a systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of warfare? I.e., did Hamas commanders say to Hamas fighters, go in and rape the women? I don't have evidence of that.
We don't have direct evidence of that.
We don't have direct evidence of that. Hamas leadership, whether you wish to believe them or not, I certainly wouldn't believe it, everything they say. Their official line is
I
that
think
was
I think
categorically did not happen.
I think it's very, very plausible that there was a systematic intent of sexual violence. We don't currently have evidence that there was a
We don't have
there was a
evidence.
command, but I certainly believe the testimony of people who were there, and I certainly think it's extremely likely. Well, it's very likely that was the case.
And that's your prerogative, but I haven't seen sufficient evidence to convince me of that. Now, I think what is it? The organization, I've got it written down somewhere. The Action on Armed Violence, AOAV. It's a UK-based statistical organization that sort of collects data on violence. So they report that about 3,000 fighters and Hamas fighters entered Israel. Right? I think Israel corroborate that number, around about that number. Right, 2 to 3,000 fighters entered. Right, about 800 civilians were killed, to use Israeli figures. Would you go with that? About
It's
800,
it's it's
850, something like
I
that?
mean, I believe that the total death count was over 1,200, but that is including the
That's right, IDF. Yeah.
IDF.
IDF and police. So about, I think the official number is 1,100, in the high 100, 1,200, let's say, right? I don't want to minimize deaths. One is too many, right? But around about, if you count IDF and you count police, so if you if you discount combatants, about 800 people were killed, right? That means that's not even a ratio of one kill per fighter, right? We don't have testimony. I'm not in a position here, nor am I willing to tell those who gave testimony of sexual violence that they are liars. I'm not here to victim shame. I'm not here to tell women you're lying. I wouldn't begin to imagine doing that, right?
Of course.
But there aren't reports that 3,000 men entered Israel on a mass raping rampage, right? I don't even think, from a military strategic point of view, that is even conducive plan, right?
I think I think the history of this is going to be put together by historians from the testimony, from the physical evidence. I mean, my point to Hamas is, regardless of whether or not there was a order for sexual violence, or whether it was just Hamas fighters and Hamas commanders, just taking advantage, as so often happens in war. The history of war is one of rape. This isn't something unique to October the 7th. This is something that has happened in wars since the dawn of time. Men misbehave in wars, and they misbehave is maybe a great
Yeah,
understatement.
yeah,
They behave in disgusting ways towards women. The history of war is people taking sex slaves, taking captives, and raping people, and that's something that's happened throughout human history. So of course it doesn't surprise me to see that happening on October the 7th. But what I would say to Hamas is, in terms of Palestinians may be traumatized, but this is going your operation on October the 7th is going to add to Palestinian trauma. This is going to increase Palestinian trauma. This is going to hurt people in Palestine even more, because what do you expect in terms of an Israeli response?
I
And
tell you, sorry,
unfortunately, you have
John.
people like Ismail Haniyeh who will say, yeah, we like Palestinian casualties. We think it's good because it strengthens our resistance, which I think is just a disgusting, perverted position.
So the reason I want to unpack these little details is because understanding what happened on October the 7th is important, because it's being used, and Israel has a nuanced right to defend itself. Of course, it has a right to defend itself. That is a right for all peoples and all nations, right? However, that right is caveated by the fact that it is an occupying power. So even in international law, that right to defend yourself is slightly diluted by the fact that you're defending yourself against the people you're occupying, right? But the reason I want to unpack these details is October the 7th was used, or is being used, as a pretext for what we're seeing currently, right? So I want to make something fundamentally clear, which is really important for you to understand, and anyone who listens to this, right?
Sure.
You won't find me supporting Hamas, right? I'm not
Good.
a fan of Hamas, right?
Good.
Even if we
Not me either.
deeply, no, I know. I'm not a big fan of Hamas. Their leadership style, their leadership strategy isn't one that I think is conducive for a long-term sustainable future for the Palestinians. I believe in the principle of armed resistance that Hamas are engaged in. But I am a critic of Hamas, as my family members will tell you. We've had conversations, and my friends will tell you I'm a critic of Hamas, right? But what I don't subscribe to, John, is this Israeli created, Western adopted caricature of Hamas. It is sufficient to criticize Hamas, right? It is sufficient to tell people where they're doing wrong, where they need to be prosecuted, and where we need to throw away the key, right? Without hyperbole,
Yeah.
without exaggeration. This whole Hamas ISIS is not only historically and sociologically and atheologically inaccurate. Those two are diametrically opposed in philosophy, right? And ideology.
There are some similarities, though.
The
I mean,
similarities are
certainly.
consequential in the sense that they for example, a similarity might be they're both armed groups. But fundamentally and principally and philosophically, they're not aligned enough for you to say, well, Hamas is ISIS.
I don't go all the way to Hamas's ISIS at all. They're different groups. They're both part of the kind of offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they do track back to Sayyid al-Khattab, right? And the ideology of Islamism, and the idea, and I think they're both believers long term I mean, ISIS is, let's establish the caliphate right now. Hamas's position is much more sort of, maybe somewhere we're gonna get Palestine, and then somewhere down the line there might be like a pan-Islamic caliphate.
I mean,
But
I don't believe they have any official aspirations or objectives outside of Palestine. But look, I take your point, and my point is this, John. My point is the whole Hamas Nazi, Hamas ISIS, making sure you use those words in the same sentence every time you talk about Hamas, right? which is so consistent that you know it's off a script, right? Hamas ISIS, Hamas ISIS, Hamas Nazi, Hamas Holocaust, right? It's because, John, Israel need to induce a certain response in you and I and everyone else when they hear the term Hamas. So they need to create a boogeyman. It's not enough. It's not enough to say Hamas committed atrocities, war crimes, they need to be prosecuted. They have to make you think that Hamas is ISIS, Hamas are the new Nazis, in order to justify and legitimize the response. And that's why, as a seeker of truth, right? And you can't get to peace without truth and justice, right?
Of course.
The reason these points are important is we need to understand fully what happened on October the 7th, which we won't unpack today in this conversation. It's going to need an investigation. It's going to need independent investigations. It's going to need Israeli investigations. It's going to need UN investigation, whatever it may be.
Of course.
But we need to see through some of the propaganda coming through. Like, John, 73% of the deaths in Israel, right, on October the 7th were men. There's videos in that weren't included in the video that you were shown of Hamas fighters, and I am no way defending or being a spokesperson for Hamas. I have no interest in that, right? I'll sooner see them removed from Gaza. I have no interest in Hamas, right? But there are videos of Hamas fighters protecting people in Israel. There are videos of Hamas fighters in Israeli homes in kibbutz. I'll argue they should be nowhere near
Exactly.
the kibbutz anyway.
That's kind of what
I'll make that point.
That's where I was going to go.
Valid, John, valid. But there are videos in there of them with families sitting them down in their living room, telling them, don't worry, we won't hurt you, just stay here. I've got them. There's videos, they're circulating all over the place, right?
I'm sure there's a spectrum within Hamas, right? I'm sure that there were some, you know, Hamas members that day who had read the Quran and they understood you shouldn't hurt civilians, right? I'm sure there were some Hamas members who were of that position, but there were, you know, there were a lot of atrocities committed that day. I think all I can really say about October the 7th is that Hamas should have understood that this was going to create a case within Israel and a case within the West for a war to dismantle Hamas in Gaza. And I think that was a terrible mistake by Hamas. And the facts of October the 7th will become more and more established by professional historians over the coming years. I look forward to reading more about it and learning more about what happened that day, and, you know, learning more about the Hamas command structure and exactly what was you know,
one of the things I'm looking forward to finding out, right? And this is something that when you bring it up, it invokes a huge amount of abuse, right? From some of your followers, right? And
I apologize for any of my followers have ever given anyone.
Don't apologize. It is the way it is. Twitter is the way it is, right? But I'm interested to find out 800 innocent civilians died, an atrocity that shouldn't be repeated. I do not believe in the targeting of civilians. That's wrong. I want to know how many of those 800, 850 were unarmed civilians, because a lot of the Israeli civilian population is armed, not too dissimilar to in America. I want to know how many of them were killed in crossfire. It's not legitimizing the death of civilians. One death is too many, right?
Yeah.
But how many? The reason I'm interested to know how many died in crossfire is because it dispels the idea that there was a systematic, deliberate targeting of civilians. I know you saw videos where civilians were targeted.
Yeah, I have seen videos.
No doubt. And that should go straight to The Hague. These guys throw away the key as far as I'm concerned, John. Throw away the key, right? But it dispels the idea that there was a systematic, deliberate command to target civilians when a proportion of those 800 were possibly killed in crossfire. I'm interested to know how many were killed by heavy-handed Israeli response, not too dissimilar to the Hannibal Directive, right? You're aware of the Hannibal Directive, right?
Although I mean, I believe that has been, the Hannibal Directive has been retracted. That no longer exists. But yes, that is. I believe that's the idea. That
you are right. You are right. It has been dismantled.
An Israeli soldier taken captive could be killed in order to prevent the hostage negotiation. But I
Correct.
believe,
It is basically the justification of the use of overwhelming force, even at the expense of your own, in order to eliminate the threat and eliminate the situation, right? And that you're right. That the Hannibal Directive as an official doctrine has been dismantled, but the ethos and the principles of heavy-handed response may still exist in some
maybe.
commanders, right? Do you want to move on to the event? Well, the response, I guess.
Yeah, can we? So if we can move on to the final segment, that will be ideal because my wife needs to work and
Uh,
she will be. You know what it's like having a wife.
I do. Apologize to her. Apologize to her for me. But yeah, I mean, Israel's response. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Israel's response? Well, I mean, it is in terms of the death count, it's far exceeding what happened on October the 7th. I think personally, my advice to Israel is minimize the Palestinian death toll even more. There's too many people dying in Palestine. There are too many restrictions on aid getting in. There needs to be more aid delivered into Palestine. Every Palestinian death is going to make it harder to achieve peace. It's gonna drive people towards supporting Hamas. So, and even after Hamas is gone, it's going to drive people to supporting Hamas 2.0. So I think Israel's response. I mean, I think it was a natural response to want to dismantle Hamas, right? I don't.
Natural or vengeful?
I mean, sometimes vengeance is vengeful feelings are unavoidable. Sometimes Palestinians have vengeful feelings,
Mhm.
right? People in this goes back throughout throughout human history is a history of people have atrocities committed against them and their population wishes vengeance.
Let me ask you a question, good faith
Mhm.
question, right?
Yep,
You've seen now, I think we're on day, I don't know, 96 or something, right?
something like that.
Do you think what you've seen and what you've observed and what you've read about and what you've heard about in terms of the Israeli response is a viable, legitimate hostage release exercise?
I think so. I think some of it has been the direct opposite of that because, like for example, the Israeli hostages with a white flag in Gaza trying to get the IDF to pick them up and take them back to Israel. They were shot dead, right? So clearly that's the opposite of a viable hostage release strategy in terms of the wider conflict. I mean, I think in terms of what Hamas's rhetoric right now, which is still all about victory and destroying Israel, I think that conflict is what Hamas is calling for. So is Israel playing into Hamas's hands with this response? I think Hamas would say so. I think Israelis, on the other hand, would say this is about pressuring Hamas. This is about destroying Hamas, and they're going to destroy Hamas. And
What are your
it kind of is what it is.
what are your thoughts in the fact that an overwhelming majority, according to polls, of Israelis believe that Israel is not using enough firepower in Gaza?
Um, Sorry, my wife now has just given me a note saying
I
I
am
have
working
work in
10
10
minutes.
minutes.
We got 10
We
minutes.
really are. Right. So if you want to ask the question again, I'll answer it.
What are your thoughts that in Israel, the overwhelming majority of people believe that not enough force is being used in
I mean,
Gaza?
I think that is I mean, I don't agree. I think the Palestinian population has suffered far too much. At the same time, they don't seem to have achieved their objectives with destroying Hamas yet either. So you can kind of disagree with it on two counts. You can say that Israel has failed to Hamas is still firing rockets, for example, which I at this point is probably quite surprising that they still have that firepower to send to Israel. So that you can criticize them on the basis that they
So, John,
have not
let's look at
achieved
it
their
like that.
objectives yet,
So
and they've hurt Palestinians too much and killed too many Palestinian civilians.
if we surmise that nothing about Israel's response can be described as this effective hostage releasing strategy, if we can agree or surmise that Israel's response has probably been the best recruiting campaign for Hamas, And we surmise that Hamas is still firing rockets, a capacity that requires infrastructure and know-how and access to
Mhm.
weapons and all that. Then, and Israel as a military machine is well versed in war. It understands this. It has strategists. It has advisors in the United States. It knows all this. It's not possible that you and I sitting on Zoom here know and can analyze better than strategists in Israel. They know this.
Oh,
For me, what it concludes is that it's not about releasing the hostages. You know what? They want to damage Hamas, but it's not even about eradicating Hamas because they know, and I think we know, you can't get rid of Hamas as an entity or as an ideology.
I
So,
mean,
what this
I
is
think they
about,
will. I think they will eventually get rid of them as an entity. Certainly not as an ideology. I think if it takes another 3 months, another 6 months, I think they will probably capture Sinwar, capture Dave, and remove Hamas from the entirety of Gaza as a power structure, and reduce them to maybe the sort of insurgency we saw in Iraq after the fall of Saddam. I think that's probably going to happen. But yeah, they certainly have not, or they have not yet succeeded in their goals.
I mean, I think from my perspective, their goals aren't the publicly stated ones. I think they want to destroy Gaza. I think they want to render it uninhabitable. I think what we've seen are clear war crimes, very, very strong suggestion of ethnic cleansing. And I think there's plausible and a reasonable argument for genocide. And then tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we're going to see proceedings at the Court
Yes,
of
we are.
Justice. And we'll see how that unfolds and we'll see what the defense is. But I think it's clear that some of the words that have come out from the IDF have rung true. I mean, the IDF said in the early, what was it? The IDF spokesman said, it's not about accuracy, it's about maximum destruction, right? And you've heard the rhetoric, right? Wipe Gaza, push them into
Right.
Sinai. You've heard it all. And
But
these aren't,
that's absolutely the wrong approach. I would strongly discourage Israel against the maximum damage view, because I think really it should be their case here is based on releasing hostages and dismantling Hamas. The publicly stated goals should be what they're focusing on, and any additional goals to that, such as ethnic cleansing of Gaza, such as the things that could be contributory towards genocide, that absolutely has to be something that is not pursued. And I would very strongly caution them against any sort of ethnic cleansing of Gaza. I think that's a terrible mistake. I think that would prolong, deepen, worsen the conflict, in my opinion. I think increasing food aid to Palestinians on the ground is absolutely crucial at this point. And
mm.
I think that we will see what happens in the ICJ case. I mean, in the end, if it brings Israel more towards wanting to have a compromise and this two-state solution and peace, I think that any sort of international institution pressure on Israel to accomplish that is going to be, very much appreciated by future generations of both Palestinians and Israelis. Because to go back to your point that the incentives are not there for a two-state solution in Israel, I believe the incentives absolutely will benefit Israelis. And I think that a two-state solution and peace is really what we need, and that's what we need to focus on. And I think Israel is, I think Israel needs to end the war as quickly as possible and focus
I'm
on
gonna
humanitarian
I'm
aid.
gonna leave it with this because I fear the wrath of your wife. And tell her honestly, I'm gonna wrap it up with this. When you hear the words of the deputy speaker of the parliament, even today repeating that Gaza should burn it all, he said, burn it all, right?
It's stupid. I think this sort of vengeful rhetoric is very counterproductive.
And
It
and
hurts Palestinians and Israelis.
and you know what, John? It's not. There's a catalogue of rhetoric. It's literally page after page after page. And what I would urge you to do when you hear this, and I'll end with this, John, is consider that these aren't bit part players. These are influential members of state apparatus, and their
Absolutely.
rhetoric filters down to the very soldiers on the front line who are
Absolutely.
filming these TikToks, who are celebrating the destruction of homes, who are sharing stuff on social media, laughing at Palestinians. It filters down the Ben Gvir's and the Smotrich's words in parliament, filters down to these people, and they represent the apparatus and the Israeli structure which is causing this war. But look,
Yeah,
I don't want there to
absolutely.
be another war in the John household. So
Any
I'll
any
wrap it
any
up.
sort any sort of rhetoric talking about the destruction of Palestinians, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, that's very, very harmful to long-term prospects of peace. And I fully condemn that.
John, let's do this again.
Yeah, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
let's pray for peace. And
Absolutely.
let's pray for peace between Israelis and Palestinians and across the world, in Sudan, in Chad, in Congo, in Yemen, in Afghanistan. Thank you,
Absolutely.
thank you so much for letting me talk
No,
to you, and
no
I really
worries.
appreciate it. And now my wife has to go to work.
Thank you very much, John. I'll speak to you soon.
Take care.
Take care.